All right, get ready to dive into a real, unique part of gaming history, huh? We're talking Gynoug, a shoot-'em-up that is known for, I guess you could say, intense visuals and some pretty brutal gameplay.
Definitely not for the faint of heart.
You bet. So, we've got a bunch of sources here, reviews, wiki entries, forum threads, all that good stuff. And today our mission is to really break down what makes this game so special.
I think a good place to start would be the visuals, right? I mean, Gynoug's art style is what most people remember, even if they haven't played it.
No, for sure. Grotesque is a word that pops up a lot in these reviews. One even calls it disgusting, straight up. Some even compare it to, like, H.R. Geiger, the alien guy. That says something.
Yeah, it's wild how they pulled that off on the Sega Genesis. That was 1991, so the hardware wasn't exactly a powerhouse. And yet, those bosses, especially, man, they're huge, detailed, really memorable. It's like, picture a monstrous old man.
Okay, yeah, I'm picturing it.
But he's fused with this massive, fleshy thing. Hard to even describe it. Really sticks with you, though. So disturbing. And on top of all that, you've got this stark contrast, right? Your character is this winged angel, and you're up against these, well, demonic nightmare creatures.
Definitely adds to the whole unsettling vibe. Like, you're this beacon of purity fighting your way through a hellscape of flesh and bone.
That's one way to put it. And speaking of fighting, we got to talk about the difficulty here. This game is known for being brutally hard, especially those boss battles.
Oh yeah, Gynoug is a total bullet hell experience. The screen is just packed with enemy projectiles, and you have to weave your way through while also trying to attack and navigate these crazy levels.
So it's not just reflexes. You got to have real strategy, like learn the patterns and all that.
Exactly. You have to anticipate what the enemies are going to do, memorize their attack patterns, and just execute these perfectly timed maneuvers.
Sounds intense. One review I saw called it a dance of death, where you got to learn the steps perfectly or get stomped on. Totally. And that difficulty is, well, divisive, right? Some reviewers found it super frustrating, but others, it seems like they live for that get good kind of challenge. Do you think that still appeals to people today?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? You'd think with modern games being more accessible and all, that old school hardcore stuff would have faded away.
There's definitely still a market for it. What's interesting is that Gynoug's re-releases actually cater to both crowds. You've got your hardcore purists who want the original experience, and then you've got options for people who maybe find that a bit too much.
You mean features like rewind and save states?
Exactly. You can tailor the experience. It's like having a difficulty slider built right in. Gives you more control, you know?
Yeah, totally. And get this, Gynoug even lets you earn achievements with cheats enabled. That's pretty cool. But speaking of options, the game gives you a pretty good variety of weapons and magic too, right? Does any of that make the game, like, less punishing?
I wouldn't say it makes it easier, exactly. It's more like you have these tools like energy balls, lightning attacks, even some ground attacks that can be strategic.
Okay, so it's about using the right tool for the right situation.
Right. It encourages you to experiment a bit, find combos that work for your playstyle. But at the end of the day, you still got to master those bullet patterns and enemy movements. No shortcuts there.
So to recap, we've got a game that's visually disturbing, super challenging, and even offers some strategic depth. But how did it go from, the Sega Genesis to modern consoles? That's a whole journey in itself.
Yeah, Gynoug's release history is pretty interesting. I think it says something about the staying power of certain games, even those that weren't like, mainstream hits. It started on the Genesis back in '91.
And then it was on the Wii Virtual Console, PC. And just a few years ago, it hit Nintendo Switch, PlayStation, and Xbox. That's pretty wild for a game that wasn't exactly a household name.
I know, right? It shows that it really connected with a specific audience, and that audience has only grown over the years thanks to these re-releases. And you know what's kind of cool? There aren't any fancy special editions with developer commentary or anything like that. It's just the raw game, presented as is. Take it or leave it.
Maybe that's part of the appeal, huh?
Yeah.
Just pure, unadulterated Gynoug. But speaking of take it or leave it, let's talk about the music, because the reviews, wow, they are all over the place.
Yeah, that's putting it lightly. Some people love the soundtrack, call it catchy and dynamic. Others say it's repetitive, grating, even headache-inducing. Probably comes down to the limits of the Mega Drive sound chip, and of course, just personal tastes.
True, what sounds amazing to one person can be like nails on a chalkboard to another. But do you think those hardware limitations held the composers back? Could they have made the music even better if they had more to work with?
It's possible, for sure. I mean, Mega Drive had some awesome soundtracks, but it definitely had its limitations. Composers had to work within those constraints.
Yeah, makes sense. But, there's something about the rawness of Gynoug's music, almost like abrasive,
Yeah.
Like it adds to the overall feeling of unease.
Absolutely. It's like a punk rock band playing in a haunted basement. Not always pretty, but it definitely has this energy and intensity that fits the game perfectly.
I like that analogy. So we've covered the visuals, the challenge, the release history, and even the music. What's next as we keep going down this Gynoug rabbit hole?
Well, sticking with the sound, let's dig a bit deeper into those sound effects. Remember that reviewer who really hated the sound of bullets hitting armor?
Oh yeah, they made it sound like torture.
Yeah.
Why do you think they went with such a jarring sound, though? Was it just like to amp up the creepy factor?
I'm sure that was part of it, but it's also important to remember, back then, sound design was different. Developers often went for those exaggerated sounds to really drive home the impact, the danger.
Like those old kung fu movies with the whap and piao every time someone gets hit.
Exactly. It might seem over the top now, but it worked. And in Gynoug's case, even if those sounds aren't always pleasant, they contribute to that distinct atmosphere. It's a good reminder that even the little things can make a big difference in how a game feels.
So you're saying even those sounds that, make you cringe, they're all part of the artistic vision?
Yeah.
That's cool. It makes you think about how much thought went into every little detail.
Yeah, Gynoug is a carefully crafted experience, that's for sure. And sound is just one piece of the puzzle. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about impact. How did this game influence other games, What's its lasting legacy?
Right, because Gynoug, it might not be as well known as some other shooters from that era, but it definitely made its mark. We've talked about the visuals and the difficulty, but did it actually inspire other developers, do you think?
Well, it's hard to say for sure if there was any direct influence, but
Yeah.
Gynoug was definitely part of this wave of 16-bit shooters that really pushed the boundaries with their art style. It showed that pixel art could be more than just cute characters and bright colors,
Like, it could be scary, too. Did any of the developers pick up on that and run with it? Did we see more games embracing that grotesque look after Gynoug?
Well, Gynoug might not have started a trend single-handedly, but it is interesting to see how other games, especially on the Genesis, started exploring those same kind of themes. Games like Splatterhouse 3 and Scourge, Hive come to mind. They also pushed the envelope when it came to violence and gore.
It's like Gynoug opened some doors,
Yeah.
Paved the way for future games to tackle those darker, more mature themes.
Definitely a possibility, and it shows that even games that don't become huge mainstream successes, they can still leave their mark on the industry. They can push boundaries, get people thinking differently.
So we've got this visually striking, brutally difficult game that may have even influenced other developers. But what about back then? How did people react to Gynoug when it first came out?
Well, it actually got pretty positive reviews. Critics praised the graphics, the challenge, the atmosphere. One even called it a hyper game, which, I don't know, that just sounds so 90s.
Hyper game. I love it. But even with good reviews, Gynoug never really became a huge hit. Why do you think that is? Was it just too niche, too hardcore for most gamers?
Probably, yeah. The difficulty, the disturbing visuals, it was a lot to take in. And remember, this was 1991. Gaming was a different world back then.
Right. Arcades were still the main thing. Consoles were just starting to get really good. Plus, no internet like we have today.
Yep, so building a community around a more niche game was a lot harder. But what's interesting is that Gynoug never really disappeared either. It built up this cult following. People who really loved it kept it alive.
It's like those horror movies that, didn't do well in theaters, but then they found their audience later on.
Totally. And those re-releases we talked about, those helped to cement Gynoug's place as a cult classic, introduced it to a whole new generation of players.
Proof that some games just have that staying power. They might not be for everyone, but they connect with certain people on a deeper level.
And that's what makes exploring gaming history so cool, right? You find these hidden gems, these games that dared to be different. They might not have sold millions of copies, but they left their mark on the industry in their own way.
Okay, so we've covered a lot, from the visuals to the sound, the challenge, the impact. But before we wrap up, I want to touch on the release history again, specifically those modern re-releases. They're a pretty big part of the story, right?
Well, absolutely. It's a great example of how certain games can find new life decades later, find whole new audiences.
It's like rediscovering a classic book. you know? One that might have been written ages ago, but the story still resonates with people today.
Exactly. And Gynoug fits that perfectly. Started on the Genesis back in '91 during that golden age of 16-bit gaming.
When arcades were still booming and consoles were pushing the boundaries of what was possible.
And Gynoug, with its unique look, its punishing difficulty, and just that overall unsettling vibe, it managed to stand out, even if it wasn't a huge commercial success.
It found its people, the ones who appreciated that it was doing something different.
And then years go by, technology changes, but Gynoug doesn't fade away. It pops up on the Wii Virtual Console in 2008, gets introduced to a whole new generation of gamers.
Like finding a hidden treasure in your grandparents' attic, you know? Some relic from the past that still has that power to surprise you.
Totally. And then in 2021, something really cool happens. Gynoug gets re-released on modern consoles. Switch, PlayStation, Xbox. And this wasn't just a simple port, it was a full-on, like, remastered experience. They cleaned up the visuals, added modern features like save states and rewind, you know, really gave it that extra polish.
So that people still cared about the game, that it deserved another shot.
It proved that some games can just transcend time and technology. They connect with people no matter when they play them.
It's kind of like restoring a classic car, you know? Keep the original design, but give it some upgrades to make it run even better.
Exactly. And that re-release sparked a whole new wave of interest in Gynoug. New players were drawn to those visuals, the hardcore difficulty, and I think there's just something cool about playing a game that's, you know, a bit of a cult classic.
Right. It's like, hey, I'm in the know. I've played this obscure gem.
It's a reminder that great games, even those from decades ago, they can still hold up today, find new fans, and keep on surprising people.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how that works. So as we start to wrap up this Gynoug deep dive, let's take a minute to just appreciate its journey, how it's evolved, and the legacy it's built. It's a game that stood the test of time, found new life on so many different platforms, and connected with players across generations.
And that's something special, for sure.
It makes you wonder what other hidden gems are out there. You know, what other games are just waiting to be rediscovered and loved by a whole new generation?
Yeah, that's the best part about diving into gaming history, isn't it? There are just so many games out there waiting to be rediscovered. You never know what you'll find. Totally. And it's a good reminder that gaming's always changing, right? What might have been considered niche or weird back in the day can become a cult classic later on. Tastes change, technology gets better, people see things differently.
It's like with music, right?
Yeah.
Or movies. Like a certain genre can be huge, then it kind of fades away, and then suddenly it's cool again for a whole new generation.
Yeah, exactly. And Gynoug is a perfect example of that. Look, the difficulty, the whole atmosphere, that might not have been for everyone back in the early 90s. But today, it's like this hidden gem that people are rediscovering and appreciating for being so different.
Like when vintage clothes come back in style. What was once old-fashioned is suddenly cool again.
Exactly. And that's what makes going back and exploring gaming history so fun. It's not just about nostalgia. It's about seeing how games have changed and appreciating those games that maybe didn't get the attention they deserved the first time around.
So as we wrap up our Gynoug deep dive,
Yeah.
what do you hope listeners will take away from this?
I hope it makes them realize how diverse gaming is and how much it's changed over the years. Gynoug is a great example of how there's more to gaming than just the big popular titles. There's a whole world of unique and challenging experiences out there waiting to be found.
And those experiences can be just as rewarding, if not more so, than the ones everyone's talking about.
Definitely. I'd encourage everyone listening to go out back and check out some older games, look for those hidden gems, and just see what else is out there. You might be surprised at what you find.
Great advice. Well, that brings us to the end of our descent into the world of Gynoug. Hopefully, you now have a better understanding of what makes this game so unique and memorable.
It's been a fun ride, and who knows, maybe you'll be inspired to try Gynoug out for yourself and experience its, well, unique charms firsthand.
And maybe you'll discover some other hidden gems along the way. Until next time, happy gaming!